What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Evelyn's voice barely whispered to herself as she stared at the flickering screen of her ancient laptop, the headline glaring back at her, Elon Musk Starship, America's ticket to Mars. At 68, sitting in her quiet kitchen with the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the dusty window, she felt a strange, unfamiliar pulse deep inside, a flicker of something long lost. It wasn't the usual ache in her knees or the loneliness that had wrapped around her like a second skin since her husband passed 5 years ago. No, this was different. It was hope. Not the kind that quietly dies in the corners of forgotten dreams, but the kind that buzzes with possibility, with a challenge, with rebellion. The world beyond her small town in Ohio was talking about rockets, Mars, and a future so far from the humdrum of her days that it might as well have been science fiction. Yet here it was, a real plan, a real chance, and somehow, she felt invited. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, her fingers trembling slightly from age or nerves, or maybe both. She thought about the countless mornings she had spent at this very table, nursing regrets like old wounds, missed opportunities to travel, the dreams of youth shelved for practicalities, the quiet estrangement from her children who seemed to live lives too busy to visit, too tangled to understand. At 68, she felt like a faded photograph, a face no one paused to remember, a life that had slipped quietly beneath the surface of the world. But this headline was different. It was a spark. Elon Musk, a man decades younger, was defying gravity in more ways than one. Here was a man who seemed to laugh in the face of limits, age, fear, failure, and audacity she hadn't felt in years. He was launching a starship not just to orbit Earth, but to carry humanity's dreams to Mars, and in that grand gesture, Evelyn saw a mirror reflecting her own buried desire, to rise, to reach, to matter again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the online video urged. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Evelyn blinked away a tear. She hadn't felt the urge to push forward in a long time. But tonight, she typed her response slowly, I'm Evelyn, from rural Ohio. What pushes me forward? The hope that it's never too late to start again. It was the first time in months she had reached out to the world, the first time she dared believe that her story wasn't finished. The kitchen around her felt heavy with silence, the ticking clock marking the steady passage of years she wished she could rewind or fast forward. Her house was filled with remnants of a life once vibrant, a faded photo of her and her late husband building a model rocket, a hobby they shared with laughter and dreams of exploration. She remembered how young she had felt then, fearless in the face of the unknown, the world wide open and waiting. Now, the same hands that built that rocket trembled as they hovered over the keyboard, uncertain if she still had the courage to take even a small step. But Elon Musk's words echoed in her mind, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Was her life important enough to try? Was she? Evelyn closed her eyes and pictured the Starship, the gleaming, powerful vessel designed to carry people beyond Earth's atmosphere, to Mars, a planet so distant it had captured imaginations for centuries. For Elon, it wasn't just technology, it was a symbol of what humanity could become, a rebellion against complacency and limits. And if Elon could dare to build a starship, why couldn't she dare to rebuild her own life? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She felt her heart quicken. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment it all changed. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying whispers of possibility. Evelyn stood up slowly, steadying herself against the counter. The house was empty except for the memories and the quiet hum of a world moving on without her. But tonight, she chose differently. Tonight, she would take one small step, not to Mars, not yet, but towards something new. She would open a notebook, dust off a pen, and write down the dreams she thought she'd lost. She would build something small, something real, something that belonged to her. The future didn't have to be something she watched from the sidelines. It could be hers. Evelyn sat back down and typed a simple declaration on her blog, a place she'd created years ago but rarely visited. if Elon Musk's Starship can aim for Mars, I can aim for my own new beginning. She smiled through tears, feeling a weight lift from her chest. It was fragile, it was tentative, but it was hers. This was no longer the story of fading away. It was the story of a quiet revolution, sparked by a man who dared to change the world, and a woman who dared to change herself. Evelyn's life before that evening had been shaped by quiet rhythms and the slow, steady weight of years stacking like autumn leaves on an empty path. At 68, she lived in the same modest house she and her late husband, George, had bought nearly 40 years ago. It was a small home on the edge of a town that had once thrived with factories and blue-collar pride but now felt like a place where time had simply stopped, holding its breath and waiting for something that never came. Her days had become predictable, a series of quiet chores and lonely hours marked by the ticking clock on the kitchen wall and the soft hum of the TV left on for company. Evelyn often felt like a ghost in her own life, wandering through rooms filled with memories she wasn't sure she wanted to face. There was a photo hanging above the fireplace, a faded snapshot of a younger Evelyn and George, laughing with faces lit by sunlight, holding a small model rocket they had built together. That rocket had been their shared dream, a symbol of escape and possibility when the world was wide and full of promise. But as the years passed, the rocket sat on a shelf gathering dust, just like the dreams it represented. Evelyn's regrets were many, but they weren't loud, they whispered in the quiet moments, reminding her of the roads not taken, the chances missed, the conversations left unsaid. She thought often about her children, Michael and Susan, both busy with their own lives in distant cities, their calls less frequent, the distance between them growing like an invisible wall. Her relationship with them was a tapestry of love tangled with misunderstandings and years of silence. She had tried reaching out, but sometimes the replies were short, tinged with impatience or distraction. It stung, but Evelyn didn't want to admit it. Loneliness settled in her bones like an unwelcome guest, making the house feel colder even when the heat was on. She remembered the nights when she and George stayed up late, dreaming about adventures they'd take, places they'd see, Europe, the Grand Canyon, even a cruise to Alaska. Life had a way of pulling them back, responsibilities and realities piling up until those dreams seemed like stories from another lifetime. George's sudden illness and death 5 years ago had closed a chapter she hadn't been ready to end. She missed his steady presence, the sound of his laughter, the way he believed in her even when she doubted herself. After his passing, Evelyn felt untethered, drifting through days that blended into one another with a dull ache. Friends stopped calling, her routine shrinking until it felt like the world no longer held a place for her. She thought of herself as a relic, forgotten and irrelevant. One key memory stayed with her, the day they launched their little model rocket in the backyard when their kids were young. The thrill of watching it soar, the smell of burning fuel, the cheers of her family. It had been a moment of pure joy and hope, a time when the impossible seemed within reach. That rocket had represented more than childhood play, it was a promise that life could still lift off, that dreams could still ascend. But that promise had faded. On most days, Evelyn felt that same fire had died inside her, replaced by a cautious acceptance that life at her age was about slowing down, stepping aside, and fading away quietly. Yet beneath the surface, a spark lingered, an ember of restless yearning she had buried deep, afraid to fan it into flame. The routine of visits to her doctor reinforced this sense of decline. "Take it easy, Evelyn," her physician would say, looking over the latest test results with a mixture of concern and gentle admonition. "You've got to listen to your body." But Evelyn often thought that it wasn't her body she needed to listen to, it was her spirit. Her children echoed the same cautious voice, worried about her, taking on too much or trying to relive her youth. Their skepticism felt like invisible chains, binding her to a role she no longer wanted to play, that of the frail, fading mother. On a day much like any other before that fateful evening, Evelyn found herself flipping through channels when a news segment caught her attention. The screen showed a towering silver rocket gleaming against a bright blue sky, its sleek shape cutting a sharp silhouette as workers prepared it for launch. Elon Musk's name flashed across the ticker. The reporter spoke of ambition, of the Starship mission to Mars, of humanity's boldest adventure yet. Evelyn watched, mesmerized. Here was a man, decades younger, with a vision that seemed to defy gravity not just in the physical sense but in the realm of possibility itself. Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of what many called impossible stirred something inside her, a rebellious spark against the quiet resignation she'd accepted for too long. His voice echoed from a podcast she'd stumbled upon days later: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Those words reverberated in her mind, a challenge and an invitation. Was it too late for Evelyn to chase a dream? Could she rewrite her story? She didn't know yet, but for the first time in years, the answer felt like maybe. That night, as the house settled into silence and stars began to prick the dark sky outside, Evelyn sat by her window, gazing upward. The vastness of space, the endless stretch of night, suddenly felt intimate and alive. It reminded her of the dreams she once dared to hold. The loneliness and fear didn't vanish, but they softened, replaced by a quiet determination to try, to take even the smallest step towards something new. The life before the shift had been marked by fading and retreat, but Evelyn sensed the cusp of transformation. The journey ahead would not be easy, and the world might not be ready to believe in her comeback. Yet in the depths of her soul, the rocket she and George once built was waiting to launch again. The question wasn't if she could fly, it was if she would let herself. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she just might. Evelyn sat in the dim waiting room of her doctor's office, the sterile smell of antiseptic mingling with the low murmur of distant conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. The crisp white walls and fluorescent lights felt suffocating, a stark reminder that time was both her enemy and her reluctant companion. Dr. Harris, a kindly but pragmatic man in his early 50s, had been telling her for months to slow down, to protect her fragile body from what aging had begun to claim. You need to listen to your heart and joints, he'd said gently, not your stubbornness. Evelyn wanted to argue, to tell him that her heart was more than a muscle weakening with age, that it still beat with fire and longing. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded, swallowing her frustration like bitter medicine. Was it too late? That question echoed louder every day, a relentless shadow hovering over her thoughts. Was she just a fading relic destined to retreat quietly, or could she rewrite the story of her life? The house felt emptier these days, the echoes of past laughter replaced by the cold silence of unreturned calls and missed connections. Her children, Michael and Susan, had started to sound more like strangers on the phone than the close family she once knew. "Mom, we just want you to be safe," Susan said during their last conversation, voice thick with concern but also something Evelyn recognized as impatience. "Why do you have to chase these crazy ideas now?" Evelyn had wanted to say that it wasn't about chasing ideas, it was about reclaiming herself, about proving that she still mattered. But the words stuck in her throat. The world outside seemed to tell her she was too old to change, too tired to fight. Society had a quiet way of pushing people like her to the sidelines, labeling them as outdated, irrelevant, or worse, a burden. Yet inside Evelyn, a fierce inner war raged. On one side was the fear, the voice that whispered she should accept the slow decline and find comfort in routine. On the other was a stubborn ember of hope, fanned by a man named Elon Musk and his audacious dream of sending humanity to Mars. She'd stumbled across a podcast of his a few nights before, a candid conversation where he spoke not just about rockets but about failure, risk, and defying the impossible. "When something is important enough," he said, "you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." His words felt like a challenge thrown across the years, daring her to rise. But doubts gnawed relentlessly. Was her passion just a futile rebellion against the reality of her age? Would anyone even care if she tried to change? Would her children see her efforts as foolish stubbornness? The silence of her empty home seemed to answer no. She was alone. Yet, Elon's presence, even if only through screens and sound bites, felt like a lifeline. She replayed his interviews, his speeches, the news clips showing the gleaming Starship rocket poised for launch. His relentless pursuit of a dream beyond the horizon became a beacon in her darkness. The climax of her inner battle came on a chilly autumn afternoon when she stood before the mirror, tracing the lines that time had etched on her face. Her reflection looked tired, worn, but her eyes held something unexpected: defiance. That day, she decided to resist the slow fade. She would take one step, no matter how small, toward reclaiming the life she thought had passed her by. But even as hope blossomed, tests came too. Her knees ached more sharply after a walk. A call from Susan carried both concern and skepticism. A neighbor's dismissive comment about folks her age trying to start new hobbies stung more than she expected. The world tested her resolve, mirroring the push and pull inside. Yet each time she faltered, she returned to Elon's words and the image of the Starship, rising boldly against the sky. It was more than a rocket, it was a symbol of rebellion, courage, and relentless hope. Evelyn realized that the battle wasn't just against age or loneliness, it was against the belief that she no longer mattered, that her time had passed. The inner war was brutal, but it was also the crucible where a new Evelyn was forged. This battle between fear and hope, between doubt and courage, was the moment everything could change. And it all began with a single, bold choice. Evelyn woke the morning after her decision with a restless energy she hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet, bathed in soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, but inside her, something was stirring, a quiet determination that wouldn't be silenced. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless drive and his Starship mission to Mars, she knew she couldn't wait for a grand transformation or a miraculous sign. Change, she realized, started with one small step. She decided to begin with something simple but meaningful: building a small telescope. It wasn't a grand gesture like launching rockets into space, but to Evelyn, it was a tangible connection to the stars she'd admired as a child, a symbol that her dreams hadn't completely faded. Dusting off a box tucked away in the basement, she uncovered an old astronomy kit George had given her years ago. The contents were mostly intact: a few lenses, a manual yellowed with age, some metal parts. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid the pieces out on the kitchen table. The act of assembling the telescope became a ritual of reclaiming her purpose. Each screw tightened and lens adjusted, a quiet rebellion against the numbness that had taken hold of her life. It was slow and sometimes frustrating, but with every moment spent on the project, Evelyn felt a spark growing inside her. She started a blog to document the journey, something she'd never imagined doing. The blank screen initially intimidated her, but she remembered Elon Musk's boldness, his willingness to share failures and breakthroughs alike. Evelyn wrote candidly, about her fears, her regrets, and most importantly, about the hope that was blooming anew. If Elon Musk's Starship can aim for Mars, she typed, I can aim for my own new beginning. Her words were raw and imperfect, but they were hers. Every evening after dinner, she dedicated time to building the telescope and writing. Sometimes, the aches in her knees and the fatigue from the day fought her resolve, but she pushed through, fueled by a quiet conviction that this small act was bigger than it seemed. As days turned into weeks, Evelyn's world slowly shifted. The telescope project gave her a focus, a reason to get up each morning beyond the routine of house chores. She found herself looking forward to the moment when she could step outside at night and peer through the lenses at the vast universe beyond. The stars, distant and unchanging, became symbols of the limitless possibilities still available to her. One evening, after completing the final adjustments, she stood in her backyard and pointed the telescope toward the night sky. Her breath caught as the moon's cratered surface came into sharp view, more magnificent than she remembered. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a deep connection to something greater than herself, a reminder that life was vast and full of wonder. Her blog began to attract attention, small at first, but steady. Comments trickled in from strangers who related to her story, who saw in Evelyn a reflection of their own hopes and struggles. Encouraged, she shared updates and photos, connecting with a community that spanned beyond her small town. The interaction breathed new life into her days, replacing loneliness with companionship found through shared dreams. But the real breakthrough came when Evelyn received a message from her daughter, Susan. It was tentative, curious, and laced with hope. "Mom, I've been reading your blog," the message said. "I didn't know you felt this way. Maybe we can talk." The word sent a rush of emotion through Evelyn, joy, relief, and the vulnerability of a second chance. The choice to build a telescope, a small act inspired by a man shooting for Mars, had ignited something powerful. It wasn't just about the stars anymore, it was about reaching out, reconnecting, and reclaiming her place in the world. Evelyn realized that sometimes, the one thing you change doesn't have to be monumental. It just has to be enough to set your life in motion again. Her journey was just beginning, but that first bold step, sparked by Elon Musk's example, had lit a fire she was determined to keep burning. Evelyn could hardly believe how much her life had changed in just a few short months. What had started as a hesitant spark, assembling an old telescope inspired by Elon Musk's audacity to reach Mars, had grown into a blaze of new purpose, connection, and unexpected joy. Her blog, once a quiet diary of dreams and doubts, was now a lively hub where people from across the country shared their own stories of late-life reinvention. Comments poured in from strangers who saw themselves in Evelyn's journey, others who had felt invisible or forgotten but dared to believe that change was still possible. One evening, as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, the glow from her laptop screen reflecting the gentle light of a new moon, Evelyn read a message that made her heart catch in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was from Susan, her daughter. "Mom, I'm so proud of you. Can we meet soon? I want to hear everything." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of healing, of bridges being rebuilt after years of silence and misunderstanding. Evelyn stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision, a mix of relief, hope, and vulnerability washing over her. The emotional breakthrough was both beautiful and terrifying. For so long, she had believed the gap between them was too wide, that time had sealed their relationship away. Now, the chance to reconnect felt like a gift she never thought she'd receive. Around her, the quiet house seemed to hum with new life. The telescope she had painstakingly assembled stood near the window, a symbol of her journey from fading away to reaching for the stars. One night, she pointed it toward the heavens and watched as the moon's craters came into crisp view, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. It was as if the universe itself was acknowledging her rebirth. But the breakthrough wasn't just emotional. It was practical and tangible. Encouraged by the growing community on her blog, Evelyn decided to hold a small gathering at the local library, inviting neighbors and anyone interested in astronomy and late-life creativity. The event was modest but powerful. People shared stories, exchanged ideas, and found in each other the courage to embrace new beginnings. Evelyn spoke openly about her fears, her doubts, and the inspiration she found in Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of the impossible. "When you think you're too old to start again," she told the room, "remember that even a starship begins with a single ignition." The applause was warm and genuine. For Evelyn, it was a moment of breaking through the isolation and invisibility that had haunted her for so long. Yet, vulnerability lingered. The path forward was uncertain, and some nights brought waves of doubt that threatened to extinguish her newfound flame. But with every setback, she returned to the lessons she'd learned from Elon Musk and her own small victories. She learned that transformation was not a straight line but a series of climbs, falls, and rises. Then came the moment that truly shifted everything. A local journalist had stumbled upon Evelyn's blog and asked if she could write a feature story about her journey. At first, Evelyn hesitated. She had never sought attention or recognition, her transformation was deeply personal. But after some thought, she agreed. The resulting article captured the hearts of readers far beyond her town. It told the story of a woman who refused to be defined by age or circumstance, who found inspiration in a visionary who dared to shoot for Mars, and who reignited her own life through courage and determination. The article went viral, shared widely on social media and picked up by regional news outlets. Messages of support flooded Evelyn's inbox, from people who felt inspired to start their own journeys, to those who simply wanted to say thank you for reminding them it was never too late. In the whirlwind of attention, Evelyn remained grounded. She was still the same woman who had once felt invisible, but now she was a beacon for others navigating their own inner wars. The phone call from Susan came shortly after the article's publication. "Mom," Susan said, voice trembling with emotion, "I want us to try again. To really be a family." Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting for this moment," she whispered. Their reunion wasn't perfect, years of distance and pain couldn't be erased overnight. But it was real, it was hopeful, and it was the beginning of a new chapter. Evelyn's story was no longer just about her, it was about all the forgotten, the overlooked, and the brave souls willing to defy the odds. The Starship that Elon Musk launched to Mars was a symbol, but Evelyn's journey proved that we all have a starship inside us, a vessel for dreams, courage, and transformation, no matter our age. As she looked up at the night sky, the vast expanse of stars stretched endlessly before her, Evelyn realized she was no longer waiting for life to happen. She was making it happen. The moment had truly changed everything. Evelyn sat quietly in her favorite chair, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the living room. The house, once filled with silence and echoes of loneliness, now hummed softly with the warmth of renewed connections and fresh purpose. She glanced at the telescope resting by the window, a tangible symbol of the journey she had taken, from doubt and isolation to hope and reinvention. Looking back on the path she traveled, Evelyn realized that what she once thought was the end had actually been the beginning of something profound. The years had taught her that life's chapters don't close neatly, and sometimes the most powerful stories emerge from the places where we think all is lost. She reflected on the nights spent alone, wrestling with the question that had haunted her for so long: was it too late? The answer had revealed itself in the quiet moments of determination, in the small but bold choice to build a telescope, to write her story, and to reach out when the walls seemed too high. Evelyn's new legacy wasn't about grand gestures or heroic feats, it was about the courage to begin again, no matter the obstacles. It was about showing herself and others that age was not a sentence but a doorway. The legacy she wanted to leave wasn't etched in monuments or accolades but in the lives she touched, the conversations reopened with her children, and the community she helped build. Her daughter Susan had become a constant presence, bridging the gap that years of silence had created. Their relationship was fragile but growing, built on honesty, forgiveness, and a shared desire to heal. Michael, too, had reached out, intrigued and inspired by Evelyn's public journey, and slowly the family found its way back to each other. Evelyn's story had ignited something in her town as well. The small gathering she organized at the library had blossomed into a monthly event where people of all ages came to share stories, explore new hobbies, and encourage each other's dreams. Her blog continued to grow, a beacon for those who felt unseen or stuck. And through it all, Evelyn carried with her the lessons inspired by Elon Musk's example. The relentless pursuit of the impossible, the courage to fail and try again, and the refusal to let fear dictate her future. She often thought about his words: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Those words had become her mantra, a reminder that worth and potential didn't diminish with age. One afternoon, Evelyn visited the local high school to speak with a group of students about her journey. She shared not only the story of her late-life transformation but also the power of dreams and resilience. The young faces before her listened intently, and she saw in their eyes the same hunger for meaning that had once driven her. She told them about Elon Musk, about Starship and the mission to Mars, about how even the most audacious dreams started with one step. "You don't have to wait for permission to matter," she said softly. "You are never too old, or too young, to change the course of your life." Leaving the school that day, Evelyn felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her life was no longer about fading away, it was about lighting the way for others. Her legacy was living proof that the spark of possibility burns bright at every age. As the seasons changed, Evelyn found joy in the ordinary and the extraordinary. Morning walks became moments of gratitude. Conversations with neighbors grew into friendships. The stars she gazed at through her telescope reminded her daily of the vastness of the universe, and the limitless potential within her own heart. One evening, sitting beneath a sky filled with constellations, Evelyn whispered to herself, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." And in that quiet declaration, she found peace. The journey had been hard, filled with doubt and fear, but it had led her to a truth deeper than she'd ever imagined. Life's value isn't measured by age or circumstance but by the courage to embrace new beginnings. Evelyn's story was not just hers, it was a beacon for anyone who has ever felt forgotten, left behind, or too old to change. In the glow of the night sky, she knew the greatest adventure was still unfolding, one bold choice at a time. And so, with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken, Evelyn looked ahead, ready to live the rest of her days with purpose, passion, and the unshakable belief that it's never too late to soar. Evelyn's life had become a mosaic of moments, some small, some monumental, but each piece carried the vibrant colors of renewal and possibility. The transformation she'd undergone wasn't just internal, it rippled outward, touching every corner of her world. One crisp morning, as the first light painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn stood in her backyard with a new project in mind. Inspired once again by Elon Musk's vision of exploring the unknown and pushing boundaries, she had decided to start a community garden. It was a far cry from rockets and Mars missions, but to Evelyn, it was a way to plant seeds of hope right here on Earth. She envisioned the garden as a gathering place, not just for growing vegetables and flowers but for cultivating connection, conversation, and healing among her neighbors. The idea felt audacious for someone who'd once felt invisible and disconnected. Yet, like Musk launching a Starship, it began with one step, sharing the idea with her local community center and securing a small patch of land. The project was met with mixed reactions. Some were excited, others skeptical. A garden? At your age? Why not just enjoy your retirement? A neighbor remarked, their tone tinged with disbelief. Evelyn smiled but didn't argue. She knew this was about more than dirt and plants, it was about reclaiming vitality and purpose. The first day of the garden saw a handful of volunteers, a retired teacher named Joe, a young mother named Clara looking for something meaningful to do, and a few curious passers-by. Together, they cleared the soil, planted seeds, and shared stories under the sun. The garden quickly became a living metaphor for Evelyn's journey, growth, patience, and the quiet power of nurturing life. Each seed buried was a promise to herself and others that renewal was possible, no matter the season of life. As weeks passed, the garden flourished, and so did Evelyn's sense of belonging. The neighborhood, once fragmented and distant, began to weave together in unexpected ways. Children came to learn about planting, elders shared wisdom about soil and seasons, and strangers became friends. Evelyn's blog chronicled the progress, drawing attention from readers who found inspiration in the tangible proof of change blossoming before their eyes. One evening, while watering the newly sprouted greens, Evelyn received an invitation to speak at a local conference focused on aging and innovation. The event promised a diverse audience, scientists, activists, seniors, and dreamers. She accepted eagerly, recognizing another chance to share her message and challenge the limiting beliefs around growing older. Preparing her speech, Evelyn thought deeply about Elon Musk's impact, not just his technological achievements but his fearless mindset. She crafted her talk around the idea that age is not a boundary but a horizon, always expanding if we dare to reach for it. The day of the conference arrived with a mix of nerves and excitement. Standing before the crowd, Evelyn felt the familiar flutter of vulnerability. But as she spoke, about her late-life transformation, the power of small steps, and the metaphor of the Starship aimed at Mars, her words resonated. She saw nods, smiles, and glimmers of hope in the audience's eyes. The standing ovation that followed was more than applause, it was an embrace of possibility, a collective recognition that the human spirit doesn't age out of dreaming. Returning home, Evelyn felt a surge of energy. The garden thrived, her relationships deepened, and her voice carried further than she'd ever imagined. Yet, even as she flourished, Evelyn remained grounded in the reality of aging. There were still aches and setbacks, moments when doubt crept in, and reminders of the years behind her. But she faced them with grace, armed with the understanding that transformation was ongoing, a journey, not a destination. Elon Musk's Starship to Mars was a bold symbol of humanity's quest to explore and expand horizons. For Evelyn, it was a mirror of her own voyage, proving that it's never too late to launch into new adventures. She often thought of the vast red planet, distant yet reachable, and how the same courage that propels rockets could ignite the human heart at any age. As the seasons turned, Evelyn's garden became a hub of activity and joy. Harvest festivals, storytelling circles, and stargazing nights filled the calendar. The community that had once been fractured was now bound by shared purpose and growing hope. Evelyn's legacy was no longer just a personal victory, it was a living testament to resilience, connection, and the power of dreams. One clear night, after the garden was quiet and the stars glittered overhead, Evelyn stood with Susan by her side, looking through the telescope at the heavens. "Do you think we'll ever really get to Mars?" Susan asked softly. Evelyn smiled, feeling the weight of their journey and the promise of the future. "Maybe. But no matter what, the important thing is that we keep reaching, toward the stars and toward each other." And in that moment, beneath the infinite sky, Evelyn knew she had found her new horizon, one where age was not an end but a beginning, and every day held the promise of discovery. Despite the steady growth of her garden, her blossoming blog, and the rekindling of relationships, doubt was a shadow that lingered in Evelyn's mind. It crept in unexpectedly, quiet whispers questioning if she was fooling herself, if the momentum she'd built would last, or if she was simply postponing an inevitable decline. Sometimes, these doubts gnawed at her during the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed indifferent to her efforts. Elon Musk's fearless boldness was a beacon, but even he must have faced moments of uncertainty. Evelyn understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. Yet, when the nights grew long and the ache in her knees reminded her of years past, the question, "Is it too late?" returned with stubborn persistence. One afternoon, after a walk that left her more tired than usual, Evelyn sat on her porch and scrolled through the news feed on her phone. A headline caught her eye: "Ageism in America, Are Seniors Being Left Behind?" The article spoke of statistics, isolation, and societal attitudes that often dismissed older adults as irrelevant. Reading the words, Evelyn felt a familiar sting. It wasn't just about her, it was about a culture that too often wrote people off as they aged. The frustration stirred a new fire within her. If the world wasn't going to change overnight, she would have to be a force for change herself. She thought about Elon Musk's defiance of norms, how he disrupted industries and dared to dream wildly against skepticism. Could she channel that same spirit? The next morning, Evelyn drafted a post for her blog, one that was more raw and honest than anything she'd written before. She laid bare her fears and doubts, her moments of despair, and the stubborn hope that kept her moving forward. The response was overwhelming. Readers thanked her for her courage, sharing their own stories of invisibility and longing for purpose. Among the messages was one from a local council member inviting Evelyn to join a committee focused on senior advocacy. It was a chance to make a difference beyond her personal journey. Taking on this new role brought fresh challenges. Meetings were often discouraging, bureaucracy moved slowly, and entrenched attitudes resisted change. Some voices dismissed her ideas, seeing her youthfulness in spirit as naive. Yet Evelyn persisted, drawing strength from Elon Musk's example of relentless innovation and refusal to accept limits. She realized that transformation wasn't only personal, it was societal. She became a tireless advocate for programs that supported aging adults, better healthcare, community engagement, and opportunities for continued learning and contribution. Meanwhile, in her personal life, old conflicts resurfaced. Susan, while supportive, sometimes struggled with the changes in her mother, wary of the vulnerability beneath Evelyn's newfound confidence. Evelyn also faced physical setbacks, a minor fall that left her shaken and painfully aware of her body's fragility. These moments tested her resolve, threatening to unravel the progress she'd made. But each time, she remembered Elon Musk's words about failure being part of the journey, a stepping stone rather than a dead end. She leaned into her support network, friends from the Garden Project, fellow bloggers, and her family. They reminded her that vulnerability was not weakness but strength, a bridge to authentic connection. One rainy evening, after a long day at the council meeting, Evelyn sat by the window watching the storm batter the trees. The tempest outside mirrored the turmoil inside her, doubt, fear, hope, and determination all swirling together. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "I am scared. I am tired. But I am still here. Still reaching." The act of writing grounded her, a quiet affirmation that she wasn't alone in this fight. In that stormy night, Evelyn made a promise, to herself and to those who looked to her, that she would keep facing the doubt, keep pushing forward, and keep believing in the power of new beginnings. Because if Elon Musk's Starship could break through the atmosphere against impossible odds, so could she break through the barriers of age, fear, and invisibility. And in that belief, Evelyn found a wellspring of strength that carried her through the darkest nights and into the dawn of each new day. The transformation wasn't just happening within Evelyn anymore. It had begun to ripple outward, spreading through her neighborhood, her town, and the quiet lives of people who had spent too long believing their best days were behind them. What started as a personal rebellion against invisibility was becoming something larger, a quiet revolution led by someone who had once felt forgotten. Evelyn hadn't planned it this way. She only wanted to build a telescope, to find her way back to the stars she used to dream about. But the courage she showed had become contagious. People who had never spoken before were now gathering in the community garden she helped create. Seniors who had withdrawn into themselves now showed up with clippings from their backyards, their hands full of herbs, tomatoes, questions, and stories. Some came for the planting, some came just to be near others, and some came because Evelyn had shown them that life didn't end at 65, it could start again. One man named Frank, a quiet Vietnam veteran in his 70s, began bringing scraps of wood to build benches for the garden. He said little at first, just nodded, worked, and left. But one day, as Evelyn walked past, he looked up and said, "You remind me of a commander I had. Wouldn't stop pushing. Made us believe we could do things we didn't think we could." It was the first compliment she'd received that brought her to tears in weeks. A few days later, Clara, the young mother who had originally joined out of curiosity, pulled Evelyn aside and asked if she could bring her teenage son to help out. "He's struggling," she admitted, "he doesn't talk to me much anymore. But I showed him your blog, and he said, 'You're kind of cool.'" Evelyn laughed. She hadn't expected to be called cool by a teenager at this point in her life, but somehow, it meant more than any award or recognition she could have imagined. That week, Clara's son came with her. He didn't say much, just helped water the seedlings and set up a compost bin. But as he worked beside Frank and Joe and a dozen other people with silver hair and quiet strength, something shifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone could feel it, generations learning from each other without lectures or judgment. Just by doing. Evelyn began to notice that the energy in the garden was changing. People weren't just showing up to help, they were coming with ideas. A woman named Janice suggested building raised beds for those who couldn't bend easily. Someone else proposed a free book exchange. Another offered to teach yoga under the trees. And suddenly, the garden was no longer Evelyn's alone. It belonged to the people. It had become a living, breathing symbol of possibility. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast everything in golden light, Evelyn stood with Susan at the garden gate. Her daughter had started visiting more often, curious at first, then quietly moved by what she witnessed. "It's not just about you anymore, is it?" she asked, her voice low but warm. Evelyn nodded. "No. But I think that's what makes it matter more." Susan looked at the rows of greens and bright flowers, the painted signs made by school kids, the weathered hands moving gently through soil and sky. "I used to think aging was something to fear," she said. But looking at you, at all of this. It's something else. It's like you found a second wind. Maybe, Evelyn said softly. Or maybe I just stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission. That line stuck with Susan. She later repeated it to her friends, then to a podcast audience where she was interviewed about her mother's story. My mom thought her life was winding down, she told the host. But then she heard Elon Musk talk about Mars. About doing things because they matter, not because they're easy or likely. And something clicked for her. She didn't just build a telescope, she built a movement. Evelyn listened to the episode, humbled and stunned. She hadn't set out to start anything big. But maybe that was the secret. Movements didn't begin with leaders in suits behind podiums. They started with a woman in her 60s picking up a screwdriver, or a veteran who built a bench, or a teenager who learned to listen. Around town, word spread about the garden. Local news did another feature, calling it the place where time grew backwards. That made Evelyn laugh, but there was something truthful in it. The people who came there weren't getting younger, but they were reclaiming time they thought they'd lost. Evelyn was invited to speak again, this time at a city forum where leaders asked how to replicate what she'd created. She gave a simple answer: you can't manufacture purpose. But you can make space for people to find it again. Not everyone understood, but those who did nodded deeply. Evelyn wasn't interested in fame. She didn't want her name on plaques or buildings. What she wanted, what she had come to cherish, was watching someone's eyes light up when they realized they still had something to give. When she went home that night, she sat by the telescope and gazed up at the sky. The stars looked the same, but she didn't. She had changed, not into someone new, but into someone fully awake. Elon Musk's rockets might reach Mars one day, but Evelyn had already launched something of her own, a rebirth of hope in her little corner of Earth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greater mission all along. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The first real setback came on a morning that began like any other. Evelyn had just finished her tea, ready to head to the garden and check on the sprouting pumpkins, when a sharp pain in her hip dropped her to the floor. She didn't cry out, she couldn't. The world tilted, the light overhead pulsed in and out, and for a moment, she wasn't a community leader or a woman who had reignited her life. She was just someone lying on the floor, unable to stand. Hours later, at the hospital, a doctor confirmed what she already suspected: a hairline fracture in her left hip. "It's going to take time," he said gently, flipping through her chart. "You'll need to rest, then transition into physical therapy. You'll recover, but no gardening, no long walks, and no heavy lifting for a while." Evelyn nodded numbly. She'd heard those words before, from other doctors, from other patients. But they didn't sting any less. In her mind, she had just begun. The garden was blooming, her blog was alive, and for the first time in years, she'd been looking forward to each day. Now, she was confined to a bed in a room that smelled of antiseptic and silence. Susan visited the first evening, trying to mask her worry behind a brave smile. "It's just a pause, Mom," she said, fluffing her pillow. "You've been going 100 miles an hour. Maybe this is your body telling you to take a breath." Evelyn forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She appreciated the kindness, but to her, it didn't feel like a pause. It felt like being pushed back into a version of herself she thought she'd left behind, the one who waited for life instead of living it. Alone in her hospital room that night, Evelyn stared out the window. The stars were faint, blurred by the city lights, but she imagined Mars out there, distant and defiant. Elon Musk's words echoed in her memory: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." She whispered them aloud, trying to believe them. But doubt had crept in again, heavier this time. The next few days blurred together. Nurses came and went. Meals arrived and were barely touched. Evelyn's phone lit up with messages, friends checking in, volunteers offering to run the garden in her absence, readers sending love from across the country. But she couldn't bring herself to respond. Not yet. Healing wasn't just physical. It was emotional, and it required facing something she hadn't wanted to admit, fear. Not just of aging, but of losing the momentum she had fought so hard to build. Lying still in that narrow bed, Evelyn began to wonder if her resurgence had only been temporary, a flash of light before the long, slow fade. Then one afternoon, Frank visited. He stood in the doorway of her hospital room, holding a carved wooden star in his calloused hands. "Made this for you," he said simply, walking in without waiting for permission. "Figured you'd need something to look at besides these walls." He placed the star on the windowsill. It caught the sunlight, casting a warm shadow across the bed. "Garden's fine," he added. "Clara's son's been showing up early, even helps the old folks. Guess you rubbed off on us." Evelyn blinked fast, tears welling. "I feel like I lost it, Frank. Like I was flying and now I'm grounded." Frank nodded, pulling up a chair. "You ever watch a rocket launch?" She smiled faintly. "Of course. You ever see what happens when something goes wrong?" "Yeah. They fix it. Or they fail and start again." Frank leaned in, voice low and steady. "Exactly. They don't scrap the whole mission. They don't say the stars aren't worth it anymore. They go back to the hangar, rework the pieces, and get back out there." Evelyn stared at him, the words landing like seeds in soil long waiting for rain. He grunted and stood. "You don't need to run the garden. You are the garden. You planted something in all of us. We'll keep it growing till you're ready to come back." After he left, Evelyn looked at the carved star, her chest tight with emotion. Maybe healing didn't mean losing momentum. Maybe it meant learning how to keep moving even when you couldn't walk. That night, she opened her laptop for the first time since the fall. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant, then began to type. It's not always going to be forward. Sometimes it's sideways. Sometimes it's still. But even when I can't stand, I'm still looking up. She posted the blog entry, unsure if anyone would read it. Within minutes, replies flooded in. Messages from people in wheelchairs, recovering from surgeries, or dealing with grief. "Thank you for saying what I've been feeling. You're still leading, even from a bed. Your words are the garden now." Evelyn wiped her cheeks. She hadn't failed. She had just hit a patch of turbulence. And like Musk's rockets, she could pause, reset, and prepare for the next launch. Physical therapy began a week later. It was slow, painful, humbling. But each time she stood with the help of a walker, each inch she moved on the parallel bars, she imagined herself as a starship rebuilding its thrust. She wasn't done. The mission was still alive. The garden was still growing. And Evelyn, grounded but not broken, was still reaching for the sky. The rhythm of recovery was unfamiliar, but Evelyn came to respect it. Each morning in the rehab center began the same way, dim light through beige curtains, the metallic clink of walkers, and the cautious greetings of people learning how to rebuild their bodies. There were days Evelyn hated it. Days when her muscles refused to cooperate, when her hip throbbed, when she looked at the mirror and saw an old woman again instead of the firebrand who had built a garden and challenged her community to dream. But somewhere in the repetition, in the soft steps down the hall, the grit of lifting herself out of the chair, the quiet smiles exchanged between patients, she found a strange peace. Movement, however small, was still movement. Progress wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper. Elon Musk once said, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." Evelyn repeated those words under her breath during therapy. She didn't need to win any races, she just needed to keep going. The staff began to notice. Her therapist, a patient woman named Tasha, told her, you've got this look in your eyes. Like you're trying to launch something. Evelyn smiled, gripping the walker. I am. Her phone never stopped buzzing. Friends sent updates from the garden, photos of squash blossoms, new benches, children running through the paths. Clara's son had organized a weekend compost workshop. Janice had led a poetry night under the stars. The garden had not only survived, it had matured, evolved. It had become what Evelyn always dreamed it could be, a living legacy. But one message struck a deeper chord. It was from a man named Harold, a reader from Minnesota in his early 80s. He wrote, "I've followed your blog for months. I used to be a machinist. Loved building things with my hands, but after my wife passed, I didn't touch my tools again. Your story, your telescope, it made me dig them out of the garage. I started fixing things. Last week I helped my grandson build his first drone. Thank you for reminding me I still matter." Evelyn read the message again and again. She closed her eyes and saw her telescope, the night sky, her trembling hands the first time she picked up a screwdriver again. She realized she hadn't just reignited her life, she'd lit torches in people she would never meet. The idea stirred something deep in her. When she returned home, and she would return home, what would her next chapter look like? The garden was thriving. The community had found its legs. The blog was no longer just a reflection, it was a call to action. And now, she felt another kind of urgency building inside her. Not just to recover, but to evolve. One night, while flipping through an online video about SpaceX's latest Starship test flight, Evelyn saw a group of young engineers clustered around a screen, cheering as the prototype lifted into the sky. The rocket didn't reach orbit. It exploded midair, a fireball over the Gulf. The room in the video went quiet. But Elon Musk stood there, calm, focused, and said something Evelyn would never forget: "This is a learning experience. We'll take what we learned today and build the next one better." Evelyn paused the video. The rocket had failed. But they didn't call it failure. They called it learning. That was it. That was the mindset that had carried her this far. Not perfection. Not a flawless journey. But the willingness to show up again. The willingness to build the next one better. The next morning, Evelyn started journaling. Ideas spilled out like a dam had broken: new ways to involve elders in STEM education, a mobile garden unit for retirement homes, even a podcast called Late Bloomers, Stories from Life's Second Act. She didn't know how to launch a podcast, but then again, she didn't know how to build a telescope either, until she did. The difference now was that she no longer saw her age as a barrier. It was an asset. It was the fuel. Evelyn returned home 6 weeks later, her gait slower, but her eyes sharper. Susan was waiting at the door, flowers in hand, tears in her eyes. "You look like you just got off a space mission," she said with a grin. Evelyn laughed. "In a way, I did." Her home was filled with welcome back cards, hand-drawn notes from kids at the garden, a new cushion on her porch swing, and, on her desk, a large framed photo. It was a group shot from the garden, everyone waving at the camera, holding a sign that read, "We kept growing. Now come back and lead us to the stars." Evelyn sat in her favorite chair, opened her laptop, and wrote a new blog post titled, "The Crash is Not the End." She wrote about setbacks, about pain, about failure not being a dead end but a detour. She wrote about rockets that explode midair and people who fall in their kitchens, and how both could rise again, stronger and more capable than before. The response was immediate. Her inbox filled with stories: recovering addicts, single parents returning to school, veterans starting art classes, a 93-year-old woman in Oregon who built her first website. The flame had never gone out. It had just been tested. Evelyn's new mission was clear: help others ignite their own. This wasn't just her second act anymore. It was a movement. Not one about defying age, but about redefining it. And just like the Starship wasn't built to orbit Earth, it was meant to reach far beyond, it became clear that Evelyn's journey wasn't about getting back to normal. It was about imagining what had never been done before. In her next post, Evelyn ended with a single sentence: "The launch pad is wherever you are standing." And as she looked to the sky that evening, her body sore but her spirit blazing, she knew the ignition sequence was beginning again. The air was still, golden with the warmth of early fall, when Evelyn stood once more at the garden's edge. She leaned on her cane but held her head high. Her body moved slower, but her presence radiated the calm authority of someone who had returned not as a survivor but as a builder, even more intentional than before. The crowd of familiar faces greeted her like family. The tomatoes were ripening, the sunflowers towering, and laughter echoed from the community table. Clara ran up and hugged her tight, nearly knocking her off balance. "Easy," Evelyn chuckled, steadying herself. "I'm patched up, not made of steel." "Sorry," Clara smiled, stepping back, "we just missed you. It hasn't been the same without you." Evelyn looked around. "It's better. Stronger. You all made it better." Later that evening, after the laughter quieted and people drifted home, Evelyn walked the rows of the garden slowly. Every plant felt like a memory. Every blossom held a story. Frank's benches, now weathered, still stood firm. The little star he had carved still sat on the edge of the tool shed. She sat down on one of the benches and looked up, her gaze drawn naturally to the stars. There were clouds that night, but she didn't need to see them anymore. She knew where they were. Mars. The moon. The infinite unknown. That's when the idea hit her, not like a sudden bolt, but like a seed breaking the soil. She wasn't done. Not even close. Her return was more than a homecoming. It was a beginning. If Elon Musk could build Starship after failure, and if NASA could send probes millions of miles through darkness, then she could go beyond the garden. Beyond the blog. Beyond the town. She didn't want to inspire people anymore. She wanted to equip them. What if her story became a blueprint? A framework for others, especially those who had been told they were too late to reclaim purpose. To rebuild. To rise. She went home and began planning. The podcast idea came first. Late bloomers. She envisioned it as a space where elders shared not just stories, but steps. Where a 70-year-old who started sculpting could speak alongside an 85-year-old who took up computer programming. No pity. No clichés. Just raw, radical reinvention. Susan helped with the technical side, teaching her how to edit, record, upload. Her first episode was simple, just Evelyn talking into the mic at her kitchen table. Her voice quivered at times, but it was honest. She introduced the podcast. This is a place for those of us who were told we'd had our chance. Who were taught to shrink. Who were told to slow down or settle. But we're not settling. We're launching. That single episode exploded in downloads. Comments poured in. One listener wrote, "I'm 67, retired early, and felt completely invisible. I listened to your podcast and dug out my grandmother's violin. I hadn't touched it in 40 years. Another, I played your voice for my father in hospice. He cried. He said you made him feel alive again." Evelyn wept reading those words. She knew now, this wasn't just a hobby. It was a mission. And it needed structure. She created a free online course called The Launchpad Within, built entirely for people 60 and older. No fluff. No self-help jargon. Just real tools for change. How to set a new goal, how to reconnect with lost passions, how to build community, how to fight the internalized lie that it's too late. She invited guests to speak, therapists, artists, even a retired NASA engineer who taught a session on why curiosity doesn't age. The course attracted thousands. From coast to coast, Evelyn's name became synonymous with second chances. She began receiving speaking requests from retirement communities, local universities, even a tech conference focused on age-inclusive design. One event invited her to speak after a panel on innovation after 60. She stood on a stage with bright lights, a cane in one hand, and looked out over a room of skeptical professionals. And she told them, the biggest untapped force in America isn't artificial intelligence or biotech. It's wisdom. It's the 60, 70, 80-year-old who's still alive inside, waiting for permission to matter again. The applause was quiet at first, then thunderous. Back home, Evelyn continued to walk daily, a little further each week. She wrote daily too, sharing her thoughts with her growing audience. Elon Musk remained a quiet lodestar in her thinking, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of what it meant to bet on yourself when no one else understood. She often recalled one of his more obscure quotes, "Being an entrepreneur is like eating glass and staring into the abyss." She laughed at that now. Aging was like that too, in a way. The aches. The losses. The fear of what's next. But like Musk, she had discovered that the only way through it was to keep building. Keep dreaming. Keep lighting matches in the dark. Then came the call that would change everything. A non-profit focused on intergenerational innovation had been following her work. They invited Evelyn to partner on a project that would connect older adults with younger inventors, pairing life experience with fresh technical skills. They wanted her to be the face of it. Evelyn hesitated. It was big. National in scope. Demanding. But then she remembered the girl she used to be. And the woman she had become. And she said yes. The project launched 6 months later under the name Project Liftoff. It matched retired engineers with high school robotics teams. It paired elderly farmers with urban agriculture startups. It even included an arts division where senior painters mentored young designers. The testimonials flooded in, "This changed everything. I found my calling again. I feel 30 years younger." And behind it all stood Evelyn, not as the hero, not as the founder, but as the spark. The same way Elon Musk had sparked something in her, she had lit 1,000 others. One night, Susan took Evelyn out to dinner to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the podcast. As they sat across from each other, the restaurant glowing with soft light, Susan said, "You know, Mom, I used to worry about you living alone. I thought you were shrinking. I thought, maybe it was time for me to step in." Evelyn smiled gently. "I remember." Susan reached for her hand. "But now, I look at you and I don't see age. I see velocity." Evelyn laughed, deep and full. "I like that." Later that night, back at home, Evelyn walked outside, cane in one hand, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere above her, a rocket waited on a launch pad. Maybe it would lift off tomorrow. Maybe it would explode. But someone would learn from it. Build again. Try again. Evelyn whispered to the sky, "We're still going. Still climbing." And in that moment, standing on her own launch pad, she felt the flame within her burn steady and strong. The success of Project Liftoff spread faster than Evelyn had anticipated. Newspapers picked up the story, first local, then national. She was invited to speak on public radio, interviewed by a tech magazine, and even received a handwritten letter from a senator who had lost his mother the year before and said Evelyn's work had helped him reimagine what her final years could have been. Yet amidst all the attention, Evelyn remained grounded. Not just by choice, but by the quiet solitude that still filled her home after the interviews ended, the garden emptied, and the camera crews packed up their lights. Silence, she'd learned, was the constant companion of transformation. It was in the silence that ideas germinated. It was also where the shadows returned. One evening, she stood in her kitchen staring out at the yard, tea cooling in her hand. Her phone buzzed again with messages, event invites, partnership offers, comments from strangers. She felt the strange tug of fatigue, not physical, but emotional. A sense that all of it, while beautiful, was beginning to ask more than she was sure she could give. She had poured so much into others, but lately had felt something flicker within her, something small, tender, almost wounded. Was she losing her own center in the process of becoming someone else's symbol? Was the spark dimming? That night, sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, mind swirling. Around 2:00 a.m., she sat up, pulled on her robe, and walked to the garage where the telescope still stood. It had gathered a little dust since her injury. She reached out and touched the metal, cool under her fingertips. This had been the beginning. The first step. Before the blog, before the podcast, before the garden, it was this humble telescope that helped her remember who she was. She lifted the cover and peered through it, adjusting the lens slowly until the stars came into view. They weren't as sharp as she remembered. Or maybe her eyes were more tired now. Still, she found them. Mars. Jupiter. Saturn's ring faint but visible. And suddenly, tears welled up. She couldn't explain why. They weren't the tears of grief or exhaustion. They were something deeper, an ache of awe, of remembrance. She whispered, "I'm still here." As if speaking to the stars. As if speaking to the parts of herself that needed to hear it. And in that moment, she understood what had been missing. In all her work to build bridges for others, she'd forgotten to pause and walk back across one for herself. The next morning, Evelyn took the day off. No emails. No recording. No garden. She packed a small bag, left a note for Susan, and drove north without a clear destination. Just a direction. She ended up 3 hours later in a small mountain town she hadn't visited in decades, a place she and her late husband, Walter, had once camped near when the kids were young. The smell of pine, the sound of wind through the trees, the cold, sharp air, it awakened something primal. Evelyn found a small cabin for rent and spent 2 nights there alone. No internet. No schedule. Just her, a journal, and the mountains. She wrote page after page. Some of it made sense. Some didn't. She wrote about love and regret, about legacy and fear, about the thin veil between courage and burnout. She wrote about Walter, how she missed him in a way that never really dulled, even though life had carried her forward. She wrote about her children, about aging, about the strange dignity of decline when it's embraced instead of resisted. And she wrote about space, not just the kind beyond Earth, but the kind between people, between thoughts, between moments of impact. That silence, she realized, was where truth lived. By the time she returned home, she didn't feel fixed or finished, but she felt real again. Grounded. Reconnected to her own fire, not just the one she passed to others. The garden greeted her with late autumn color. Clara waved. Frank was fixing the fence. There were new faces too. Young volunteers, new retirees, even a woman in her 90s who had recently moved to town and started sketching the garden every morning. Evelyn walked the rows slowly, touching the leaves, smelling the basil, hearing the soft hum of a community still growing. But this time, she didn't feel like the center. She felt like part of the soil. And that was better. That was richer. That night, back at home, she sat at her desk and opened a new document on her laptop. The title came easily, Echoes in the Silence. It would be her next project, not a blog, not a podcast, but a book. One meant for those still stuck in their chairs, still afraid to begin again. Not a how-to guide, but a love letter to possibility. A book that said, you are not behind. You are not late. You are simply in the pause between chapters. Elon Musk's words rang in her head again, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. This book felt important. Not because it would be a bestseller or earn acclaim. But because someone out there, some woman in Indiana or man in rural Texas or widow on the edge of giving up, might read it and believe again. Evelyn began writing every morning with the discipline of a scientist. She researched the neuroscience of aging, the history of late-in-life innovators, the poetry of old age. She quoted obscure engineers, unknown artists, backyard dreamers. And throughout the chapters, she wove her own journey, honest, raw, and unpolished. She wrote of failure, fear, physical pain, and of standing in her backyard at age 68 and building a telescope when no one believed she could. She wrote of silence. And of the music that sometimes follows. 6 months later, the manuscript was finished. She self-published it, not for speed, but for freedom. She wanted to own every word. She titled the final chapter, The Real Launchpad, and ended it with a single line, "You don't need a countdown or permission to begin. You only need to remember you're still alive." Within a month, the book found its readers. Not millions, but enough. It spread like roots, quiet, underground, powerful. Emails poured in. Handwritten letters arrived. A librarian in Detroit started a book club around it. A group of retirees in Santa Fe built their own telescope and named it Evelyn 1. And one letter, one Evelyn would keep framed, was from an 87-year-old man who wrote, "I haven't done anything new in years. But after your book, I applied to volunteer at a local middle school. They put me in the robotics club. I go every Tuesday. Those kids call me Coach. I haven't felt this useful since 1973. Evelyn held that letter close to her chest and cried. Not for sadness. For resonance. For the quiet music of something real. She didn't need crowds or stages. The fire had spread. And as long as one person found their way back to the launch pad within, it would keep burning. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, just her name written in neat, almost old-fashioned handwriting. Evelyn nearly tossed it in the recycling pile with the rest of the day's mail, bank statements, a circular for hearing aids, and a catalog for garden tools she no longer needed. But something about it made her pause. She took it to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window as golden light poured in through the curtains. She opened it carefully, the paper soft and thick, like something from another era. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten. It read, "Dear Evelyn, you don't know me, and I suppose that's what makes this so strange to write. But I need you to know what your words did for me. Last year, I was on a trajectory that felt like decay. I'm 61, recently retired, not by choice but by circumstance. The aerospace company I worked for eliminated my role. I had spent 35 years building spacecraft components, tiny, precise, often unnoticed. Suddenly, I was just, home. Forgotten. I hadn't touched a wrench in months. Then I read your book. My wife brought it home from the library, said she heard you on NPR. I didn't want to read it at first. I thought it was going to be one of those, age gracefully, things. But I read the first chapter and didn't put it down. I finished it at 2 a.m., crying in my garage. The next morning, I cleaned off my old workbench. I started tinkering again. Just small things. A model rocket with my grandson. A makeshift telescope mount. I felt awake again. 2 weeks ago, I applied to volunteer for an outreach program linked to NASA's Artemis initiative. They accepted me. I'll be teaching middle schoolers how to think like engineers. It's not Mars. But it's close. I wanted you to know. You reminded me that the work we do doesn't stop mattering just because the paycheck stops. Thank you for lighting the way. Thank you for proving we're still capable of liftoff. Jared M. Evelyn read the letter 3 times. She folded it gently and held it to her chest, her eyes brimming. In all her work, garden, blog, podcast, book, this was the thing that struck deepest, the quiet knowing that something she had created helped someone remember they were still alive. That their story wasn't over. That their gifts were still needed. She thought of the aerospace engineers she used to admire from afar. Wernher von Braun. Katherine Johnson. People who calculated trajectories that carried humans beyond the pull of Earth. Now, here was Jared. A man she'd never met, launching middle schoolers toward possibility. Evelyn thought about how often people at her age were described in terms of what they used to do. How society tucked them away like old books on a forgotten shelf. And yet, here they were, she and Jared and so many others, still writing chapters, still building. She walked out to the garden, the sun dipping behind the hills. The air carried the scent of soil and rosemary. In the far corner, the children's plot had grown wild with pumpkins, the vines twisting like dancers across the earth. She sat on the bench Frank had built and stared at the sky. Mars would rise soon. She remembered the first night she'd looked at it through her telescope and thought, that's so far away. But now she didn't feel that distance anymore. Not because the planet had moved, but because her spirit had. What once felt unreachable now felt inevitable. A voice in her heart whispered, everything you did matters. She returned to her desk and composed a reply to Jared, not to be mailed, but as a message to the greater unknown. She typed it into her journal. Dear Jared, you think I reminded you of who you were, but you reminded me of who I still am. We're all engineers of something, of dreams, of reinvention, of second chances. Thank you for building again. Thank you for reaching back into the fire. Keep going. I'll see you on the launch pad. Evelyn. She saved the entry and sat back, letting the silence settle again. The silence didn't scare her anymore. It was where echoes lived. It was where meaning rippled out long after the sound was gone. Later that week, Susan stopped by with dinner. They sat at the table, eating stew and cornbread, the kind Evelyn used to make for her kids when they were too busy to notice. Mom, Susan said between bites, have you thought about writing another book? Evelyn looked up. I just finished one. I know, Susan smiled. But maybe something different. For younger people. You've built this incredible following of older adults, but I don't know. I think younger folks could use this too. You've got wisdom people don't even know they're looking for. Evelyn sat with that thought. For months, she'd been focused on those her age and older, helping them reignite, rebuild. But what if the next chapter wasn't just about lifting the old, but about bridging generations? What if she could help young people see aging not as a decline but as a future worth growing into? That night, she brainstormed a new idea, a collaborative book. Stories told by people over 60, paired with responses by people under 30. Reflections. Questions. Echoes across the years. She'd call it the Mars Letter, inspired by Jared's note. The premise was simple. What would you say to someone 2 generations ahead or behind you if you believed they were still listening? She posted the idea on her blog and within a week received over 400 submissions. A retired jazz pianist writing to his 17-year-old self. A 22-year-old coder asking his 82-year-old grandmother how she endured heartbreak. A war veteran telling a teenage activist, your passion is the same fire that carried me through. Evelyn read each letter with reverence. She organized them by theme, love, fear, purpose, regret, joy. And as she curated the entries, something remarkable happened. She began to see the same questions appear over and over again, regardless of age. Am I doing enough? Will I be remembered? Is this it? These weren't age-related questions. They were human ones. That's when she realized, the real journey isn't from youth to old age, but from doubt to belief. From isolation to connection. From silence to signal. In one chapter, she included her own Mars letter. It wasn't addressed to a specific person. It was a message to whoever needed it most, to the one who thinks they're too late, or too small, or too broken. You are not finished. You are stardust and circuitry, scars and sunrise. You are made for motion. Even if the ground feels shaky, even if your knees ache, you are still in orbit. Keep going. The mission isn't over. It never was. She ended the book with one final thought: maybe we'll never reach Mars. Maybe the point was never the planet, but the belief that we could get there. The belief that we were meant to reach, to risk, to rise. She sent the manuscript to her publisher and titled it simply, The Mars Letter, Conversations Between Generations. And then she waited, not with anxiety, but with peace. Because no matter how far the message traveled, she had launched it. That was enough. That was everything. The garden shimmered with early morning dew as Evelyn stood in the center path, her breath visible in the crisp air. Autumn had turned the leaves amber and red, and a quiet hush hung over the space like reverence in a cathedral. A group of high school students from the local vocational program were arriving soon, part of a new partnership between Project Liftoff and the school district. The program paired elders like Evelyn with young dreamers for weekly innovation walks, an hour spent exploring how ideas could grow between generations. Today's topic: vision. Evelyn had her telescope set up under the pergola. She wiped the lens carefully and checked its stability. It was the same telescope that started it all. Still simple, still a little scratched at the base where she dropped it that first day trying to tighten the screws, but still strong. Susan had asked her once why she kept it instead of upgrading. Evelyn had just smiled and said, "It's not about better. It's about remembering." By the time the students arrived, she had already walked 2 laps around the garden. It helped her focus: left foot, right foot, breathe, repeat. She greeted the teens one by one. There were 6 of them, all local, all a bit unsure how to act around a woman in her 70s who people said had started a movement. Evelyn made it easy. "This is just a garden," she said with a grin. "And I'm just a woman who figured out she wasn't done yet." That made them laugh. She led them over to the telescope and gestured for them to gather close. "How many of you have looked through one of these before?" Only one hand went up. A boy named Malik, tall and quiet with thoughtful eyes. Evelyn nodded. "All right then. Today we're going to talk about looking forward. But first, let's talk about what it means to focus." She let each student take a turn adjusting the telescope. Some fumbled. Others squinted. One girl, Lacey, laughed nervously and said, "I don't see anything." Evelyn stepped in gently. "You will. Just take your time. Focus isn't instant." Lacey tried again and gasped softly. "I see it. Is that Jupiter?" Evelyn beamed. "It is. Light that left that planet almost 45 minutes ago just reached your eye. What you're seeing is a memory carried on a beam of light." The students leaned in, curious now. Evelyn continued. "We live in a world obsessed with immediacy. With speed. But some of the most powerful things, like clarity, purpose, healing, they take time. You can't rush focus. Not in the sky. Not in your life." She told them how she'd built that telescope after almost giving up. How a single moment of inspiration from a man who believed in Mars had set her on a path back to herself. She saw them shift, stand straighter. Eyes widened. Their postures softened. Evelyn felt it, the invisible thread pulling across the age gap. Malik raised his hand. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," she said. "How did you not give up? I mean, when you were in pain. Or when people doubted you." Evelyn thought for a moment, choosing her words with care. "Because I realized giving up wasn't the end of suffering, it was the end of meaning. Pain is part of life. But purpose? Purpose transforms it." She walked slowly to the table nearby where she had laid out a collection of objects. Photos of her garden in its early days, one of Frank's sketches, a printout of Jared's Mars letter, and a small wooden star carved from the bench. "This isn't just my story," she told them. "It's a torch. One that was handed to me by people who believed when I didn't. Now, I'm passing it to you. One of the girls, Alicia, whispered, "You really believe we can do something important? Even us?" Evelyn turned, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "You already are." After the session, Malik stayed behind. He helped Evelyn pack up the telescope, careful and deliberate. He spoke quietly. "I build things too. Mostly drones. My grandpa was a mechanic. Taught me everything." "He sounds like a good man," Evelyn said. "He passed last year," Malik replied. "I almost stopped building after that. Felt like the air just went out of everything." Evelyn rested a hand on his arm. "Maybe you stopped building for others. But you were still building within. Sometimes healing looks like nothing. But it's still real." Malik looked down. "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" "I think he already is," she said. "And I think he sent you here today." The boy nodded, blinking fast. Then he smiled. "Thanks, Ms. Evelyn." She smiled back. "Call me Evelyn. I work for you now." That night, she updated her blog. The entry was titled, "Passing the Torch." She wrote about how we measure time in birthdays and calendars, but we experience time through connection, how a single conversation could stretch across decades, how a touch or a look could carry the weight of lifetimes. She included a photo of Malik standing beside the telescope, pointing at the sky. The caption read, "The future isn't someday. It's already here, building itself quietly." Comments poured in. People recognized the moment for what it was, not just a lesson, but a transmission. One reader wrote, "I've never thought of my wisdom as a tool I could hand to someone else. I've just been holding it in my chest. Thank you for showing me how to give it away." Evelyn closed her laptop and sat in the stillness, heart full. The wind rustled outside. A car passed on the road. Somewhere far above, light from distant stars was still traveling toward Earth, set in motion long before she was born. And she wondered, who else was looking up tonight? Who else needed to be reminded that they weren't too late, that they could still look forward, still shape something vital? She whispered aloud, as if to the cosmos, "I'm here. I see you. Don't stop building." Then she stood, stretched slowly, and walked out to the porch where her telescope waited. It was old now. A little battered. But it still worked. Just like her. And tomorrow, she would show another group how to find their own focus. How to adjust the lens. How to look up. Because that's what she'd become. Not just a gardener or a writer or a speaker, but a lighthouse. And lighthouses don't chase ships. They just shine. The snow arrived early that year, blanketing the town in soft white before Thanksgiving. Evelyn sat at the window wrapped in a flannel shawl, her fingers curled around a mug of cinnamon tea. Outside, the garden slept under layers of snow, but she didn't see dormancy anymore. She saw rest. Renewal. A kind of patience the young often mistook for stillness. She no longer feared winter. It was part of the rhythm. And she had become fluent in rhythms. She had spent the last few months turning her focus towards something new, something bigger than she'd ever attempted. With Malik's help and a group of students from the local STEM club, she'd begun designing a project unlike any she'd imagined before, sending something from the community garden to the edge of space. It had started as a joke during one of the innovation walks. Malik had said, "We should launch one of your tomatoes into the stratosphere." Evelyn laughed then. Wouldn't that be something? A tomato in orbit. But the idea had stuck. And slowly, the joke transformed into a blueprint. Not a tomato exactly, but something representative. Something that embodied the garden's legacy. A seed. A single seed. One of the sunflowers planted by Clara in the children's patch. Malik researched weather balloons, trajectory maps, altitudes, payloads. They weren't trying to touch space, but they could get close, up to 100,000 feet. High enough to see the curve of Earth. High enough to say they'd reached. Evelyn reached out to Susan, who contacted an old college friend now working in media. A week later, the project had a name, the Bloom Capsule, and a short video trailer posted online. A seed from a garden started by a woman who was told she was too old. Now lifted by the hands of the next generation, reaching for the edge of the sky. The clip was only 90 seconds long. But it went viral. Comments poured in from every state. Donations came in. Teachers wrote to ask if their students could follow the launch. Elders wrote poems. Children sent drawings. NASA reposted it with a single word, beautiful. Evelyn watched it unfold from her chair by the window. She'd never asked for fame. She didn't want to be known. She just wanted others to believe again. Believe in beginnings. In motion. In becoming. On launch day, the whole town came. People brought blankets and coffee, bundled in coats and scarves. Malik stood by the launch table, running final checks. The capsule was small, no bigger than a shoebox, made of reinforced foam and adorned with artwork from the local elementary school. Inside, protected in a transparent vial, was the sunflower seed. And alongside it, a handwritten note from Evelyn: this seed was planted once in a forgotten corner of a small town. It grew tall. It bent in the wind. And when it bloomed, it taught us that even in our final seasons, we can still rise. She stepped up to the mic, her breath visible in the cold air. I once looked at the stars and thought I'd missed my chance, she said. But today, I see something clearer. Purpose isn't about age. It's about trajectory. You don't need to be young to launch. You just need to believe you're not finished. The crowd fell silent. Then applause broke out, slow, then roaring. Clara hugged her waist. Frank wiped tears from his eyes. Susan stood nearby, filming through tears. Evelyn gave the nod. Malik released the balloon. It lifted slowly at first, then caught the wind. The capsule wobbled gently and began its ascent. The crowd watched until it disappeared. Some people wept. Some cheered. Evelyn just stood still, eyes on the sky, heart quiet. Hours later, they tracked the capsule's descent via GPS. It landed safely over 80 miles away in a field just outside a rural county. Malik and Susan drove to retrieve it while Evelyn stayed behind to host a live stream for the hundreds watching online. The moment they confirmed recovery, cheers erupted. Malik held up the capsule on camera. It made it, he said, voice cracking. It really made it. The Bloom capsule was returned to the garden 2 days later and placed in a glass case under the pergola. The seed remained inside, never planted, never consumed, but preserved, not because it was sacred, but because it had completed its purpose. A symbol of what could rise from soil, silence, and second chances. The project became a national model. Schools contacted Evelyn for curriculum. Universities asked her to speak. A museum in Washington requested to host the capsule for a special exhibit on everyday visionaries. But Evelyn declined. Let it stay here, she said. Where it bloomed. More letters arrived. One from a woman in her late 70s who read about the capsule while sitting in a hospital bed, waiting for test results. She wrote, I haven't wanted to try anything new in years. But after reading about you, I enrolled in an online class for digital painting. I'm scared. But I also feel 17 again. Another from a man in Florida who lost his wife after 52 years. Your story didn't take away my grief. But it reminded me that I'm still here. And while I'm here, maybe I can still give something back. Evelyn read them slowly, placing some in a wooden box by her desk. Others she pinned to her bulletin board. But all of them told the same story in different words: hope travels. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought blossoms in abundance. The garden exploded with color, tulips, marigolds, lettuce heads and snap peas. Clara's sunflowers returned, taller than before. Malik had graduated and was headed to a college that offered him a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering. "I wouldn't be here without you," he told Evelyn at his going-away party. She shook her head. "You were always going. I just held up the light so you could see the path." That night, after the celebration, Evelyn returned to the garden. The stars were out. Mars was faint but visible. She sat on the bench with the carved star. The air was cool. Her bones ached in places she no longer feared. She wasn't afraid of endings anymore. She wasn't racing time. She was walking with it. "You're doing just fine," she whispered to herself. Just fine. A breeze moved through the garden, brushing her cheek like a kiss from someone long gone. And for a moment, she imagined every hand that had touched this place, Frank's steady fingers, Clara's small palms, Malik's careful tools, Susan's constant care. She imagined Elon Musk on a distant launch pad, staring at a rocket that might never work, but lighting the fuse anyway. And she imagined every person who had once believed they were too old to rise, now standing in a new kind of garden, planting something again. The garden had reached the stars. And still, it grew. The morning began like most, with birdsong outside Evelyn's window and the faint creak of her bones waking up before the rest of her. She moved slower now, not out of weakness, but with the deliberate grace of someone who had finally made peace with time. The garden had entered another season of abundance, and the routines were familiar: coffee, a short walk, journaling, a visit to the pergola to greet whatever group was gathering that day. But today held something different. Evelyn felt it in her chest before she understood it in her mind, a kind of stillness before transformation. As she reached her desk, a small stack of mail caught her eye. On top was a flat envelope from SpaceX, stamped with a mission seal and a sticker that read, "Personal." Her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single letter on sleek white stationery, printed in precise typeface but signed in ink. "Dear Evelyn, we at SpaceX have been following your story for months. What began as a community garden initiative has grown into something extraordinary. The Bloom capsule was brought to our attention by several team members, and it has become a source of real inspiration here. At SpaceX, we often talk about Mars not just as a destination, but as a test of will, imagination, and endurance. It's about believing we can overcome limits, technological, psychological, even cultural. Your story represents all three. We'd like to invite you to attend the next Starship prototype test at our Texas facility. You'll meet the engineers, tour the site, and watch a test launch from a reserved platform. You are, in every way, part of this mission. With admiration, the SpaceX team, and Elon sends his regards personally." Evelyn read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She exhaled, a laugh bubbling up from some deep, giddy place inside her. Her hands still trembled, not from fear, but from wonder. She wasn't used to this kind of recognition. She never did it for recognition. But this invitation felt less like an award and more like a full-circle moment. She whispered, "Mars." After all this time. Days later, Susan drove her to the airport. Malik had called from college when he heard the news. "You have to go," he said. "And take pictures. A lot of them." Evelyn promised she would. The flight was uneventful. The arrival wasn't. She was greeted at the gate by a young woman with a badge and a sharp smile, who introduced herself as Lana, part of the external affairs team at SpaceX. They drove in a clean white electric SUV along the dusty Texas coastline toward the sprawling compound. The sight took Evelyn's breath away. Sleek domes, massive rockets in different stages of assembly, the distant glint of launch pads against the blue horizon. The place buzzed like a hive. Engineers in jumpsuits walked briskly between buildings. Drones hummed overhead. And then, there it was, the Starship prototype. Gleaming. Towering. Defiant. Evelyn stood at the base of the viewing platform, craning her neck. "It looks like a dream made of steel," she whispered. Lana smiled. "That's about right." The tour was surreal. Evelyn met engineers who had read her book, who thanked her for helping their grandparents reconnect with curiosity. One young man, barely in his 20s, said, "My Nana started painting again because of you. I hung one of her watercolors in our design lab." Evelyn teared up. "Tell her thank you. For still creating." In the Mission Control Gallery, she was shown a display that tracked the trajectory of future Mars missions. A digital arc traced the path from Earth's gravity well into deep space. It reminded Evelyn of something, a drawing Clara had once made in the garden. "Can I ask a question?" she said. A senior engineer nodded. "Of course." "Why Mars?" He smiled. "Because it asks everything of us. And because it reflects who we are becoming." Later that evening, Evelyn was brought to the observation deck for the test launch. She stood with a small group of guests, mostly donors and partners, their faces lit by the amber glow of the platform lights. As the countdown began, Evelyn found herself gripping the railing. She thought about her own countdown. Not to launch, but to rebirth. She had once felt finished, grounded, forgotten. Now she was standing at the edge of history with fire in her chest. The engines ignited. Thunder roared. The rocket rose like a slow-moving sun, the ground trembling beneath them. Evelyn watched with tears streaming freely. It wasn't just a machine breaking gravity. It was every person who had ever dared to begin again. It was every grandmother who picked up a paintbrush. Every man who walked into a robotics club after a decade of silence. Every person who had told time, "You don't own me." The Starship climbed higher, its flame a pillar against the vast sky. When it vanished from sight, the crowd erupted in applause. But Evelyn remained quiet. Her heart was louder than anything around her. After the launch, she was escorted back to the visitor center. A small private room had been prepared with refreshments and a chance to rest. On the table was another envelope. Handwritten this time. No badge. No logo. She opened it. "Evelyn, I've read your story. I've shared it with people here and people far beyond here. You reminded me of something I sometimes forget. That no matter how far we reach, it's the human story that makes space worth touching. You found your own version of Mars and brought others with you. That's the mission. We'll be in touch." Elon. Evelyn smiled, folding the letter slowly. No promises. No grand offers. Just acknowledgement. That was enough. She stayed an extra day, walking the grounds, talking to younger staff, taking notes. She asked questions they didn't expect, about what scared them, what they still dreamed about, who they missed back home. And in every conversation, she planted something, a phrase, a story, a spark. By the time she flew home, she felt like a woman who had touched orbit. Not with her body. With her presence. With her fire. When she returned to the garden, the town greeted her like she was a local astronaut. Banners had been strung across the pergola. Children held up drawings of rockets and stars. Malik had even made her a small metal medallion etched with the words, "Trajectory, still rising." That evening, Evelyn walked the rows alone, touching each plant with reverence. The sky had turned that peculiar violet of late spring, and Venus shimmered faintly in the east. She paused near the old telescope, now lovingly maintained by Clara and a few of the neighborhood teens. She looked up. Mars was there. Small. Faint. Far. But no longer unreachable. She said aloud, "You're not a finish line, are you? You're a mirror." Because now she understood. Mars wasn't the goal. It was the reflection of what we could become if we refused to stop growing. It was the echo of every late bloom. Every bold restart. Every choice to believe again. Evelyn turned away from the stars and walked back inside. Tomorrow, there'd be another group at the garden. Another spark to light. Another story to begin. She was still rising. Evelyn's mailbox was overflowing again, but she didn't mind. The mail carrier had stopped asking if she wanted to set up a P.O. box. He now simply smiled as he handed her the bundle and said, "You're changing the world, Miss Evelyn. One envelope at a time." It had become a daily ritual. She'd carry the stack inside, brew her tea, and read them slowly by the kitchen window where the morning sun poured in. Some were short. Some were pages long. Many were handwritten, the paper smudged with tears, coffee, or fingerprints from little ones helping address the envelopes. They came from everywhere: Idaho farms, Bronx apartments, Arizona deserts, Maine fishing towns. Each was a heartbeat sent across time and space, beating in rhythm with hers. She never expected this. When she started her blog, when she walked the garden paths and dared to speak up, she only hoped to reach a few. Now, she was reading stories from the corners of America she'd never seen. She didn't just read the letters. She responded to as many as she could. Sometimes with just a few lines. Sometimes with a full page. She'd included a "Letters from the Earth" section on her blog, publishing excerpts, with permission, and adding her thoughts beside them like annotations in a shared book of life. One letter read, "I was laid off 2 years ago. I stopped shaving, stopped showing up. I told myself the world had taken its last from me. Then I read your piece about planting garlic in winter. About trusting what you bury. I planted too. Not garlic, just an idea. And now I'm 2 months into launching a woodworking business I used to only dream about. I haven't made a profit yet. But I'm alive again." Evelyn wrote back, "Profit isn't always in numbers. Sometimes, it's in breath. In forward motion. Keep carving." Another came from a woman in Mississippi: "I buried my mother this summer. She was my best friend. We used to walk through our backyard barefoot and talk about what we'd plant next year. I hadn't touched the yard since. Then I read about your Mars seed. How you lifted a tiny thing to the edge of space. I went outside the next morning and stood in the dirt. It hurt. It also healed. Thank you." Evelyn wrote, "Love never stays buried. It sprouts. Sometimes in places you're too heartbroken to expect. I believe your mother is blooming through your feet." But one letter struck her differently. It arrived in a weathered manila envelope, addressed in careful block letters. Inside was a photo, black and white, dated 1968. A man and woman in their 30s stood beside an old-fashioned rocket prototype, grinning wildly. Taped to the back was a note, "That's me and my wife, Mabel. We met working at a now-defunct aerospace lab. She ran calculations by hand. I was a welder. We always dreamed about someone like you coming along, someone to remind folks that dreaming wasn't just for men in suits or kids with plastic helmets. You brought us full circle." She passed away last year. But I still talk to her when I look at the stars. I think she'd have loved your garden. Evelyn held the photo close. She studied their faces, radiant and young, before the world tried to shrink them. She whispered, "You made the future. Even if they never gave you credit." That night, she wrote a blog post titled, "The Ones Who Laid the Runway." In it, she talked about how dreams don't begin with liftoff. They begin with groundwork. With welders and calculators and secretaries who stayed after hours. With people who never made headlines but whose fingerprints were on every launch, every innovation. She ended the post with this: "Maybe you never saw the rocket leave. But you were the ones who lit the fuel." The post exploded. Engineers shared it. Historians quoted it. A university requested to turn her letters into a traveling exhibit. And Evelyn, overwhelmed but centered, said yes, on one condition. Let it be free. Let it reach places without museums. Put it in libraries. Put it in grocery store foyers. Print the letters on walls in nursing homes. Within weeks, Letters from the Earth became a national project. Printed panels of correspondence and responses were displayed in unlikely places: post offices, veteran centers, church basements, bus stations. Strangers stood reading together, silent but connected, absorbing the shared truth. That everyone wants to be remembered, to matter, to leave a spark. In a high school in Tulsa, students began writing their own letters to older adults in their community, asking, "What's something you wish we understood about life?" A nursing home in Oregon turned a wall into a memory mailbox, where residents could pin up stories they wanted others to carry. A group of fourth graders in Kentucky planted a sunflower for each letter their school received in response. The garden had gone viral. Not in likes, but in legacy. One morning, Susan called her in a rush. "Mom, turn on the news. Now." Evelyn did. The screen showed a montage, clips of the Bloom capsule, a photo of her holding the Starship letter, then an anchor announcing, in recognition of her impact across generations, Evelyn Hammond has been selected as one of Time's most influential people of the year. Evelyn blinked. She hadn't even known she was nominated. Susan was crying on the phone. "You're on the list, Mom. Next to scientists. Artists. Presidents." Evelyn felt the weight of that. But also the lightness. "Well," she said softly, "it's about time they added a gardener." The news went viral. People across the country sent messages of congratulations. Talk shows called. Journalists asked for interviews. Evelyn accepted a few, declined many. Not out of pride, but to protect her rhythm. The garden needed tending. Her knees still needed warming salve. The world could celebrate her. But she would stay grounded. That night, she stood under the pergola, hands clasped, eyes skyward. Mars glowed faintly overhead. She whispered, "I see you. Not just the planet, but the dream. The mirror. The reminder." She thought of everyone who had written. Everyone still waiting to believe it wasn't too late. Everyone scared to try again. She sat at her desk and wrote a final letter. One she would post publicly, one last entry for the Letters from the Earth project, to the one who still doubts, "I know what it's like to feel irrelevant. To think the world has passed you by. To wake up and wonder if your best story's already been told. But let me tell you this, the ground still waits for you. The sky still listens. And your voice, cracked, quiet, tired, it still matters. You don't have to build a rocket. Or write a book. Or start a movement. You just have to believe again. Plant one thing. Make one call. Fix one small piece of something broken. That's enough. That's motion. And motion, no matter how slow, is life. Mars isn't about distance. It's about daring. And you, dear reader, are still daring. With love from a woman who once thought she was done, Evelyn, she pressed, publish, and closed her laptop gently. In the quiet that followed, she could almost hear the letters rustling in mailbags across the country, could feel the hands reaching for pens, keyboards, seeds, door handles, tools. She could feel the movement. The rising. The bloom. Evelyn stood, stretched, and walked outside. The wind carried the scent of earth and dusk. The garden breathed, even in the fading light. And above it all, the stars held steady, waiting for the next letter to arrive. The countdown clock ticked steadily, each second slicing through the thick Texas air like a heartbeat. Evelyn stood on the observation deck, surrounded by a handful of guests and SpaceX engineers, but her attention was elsewhere. The Starship stood before her, massive, gleaming, a monument to audacity and human will. It was the final prototype before the historic manned mission to Mars, and today was the ultimate test flight, a symbol of possibility that felt deeply personal. Around her, conversations hummed, last-minute checks, final instructions, the quiet confidence of a team who had poured years of sweat, sleepless nights, and hope into this moment. Evelyn's heart drummed with a mix of excitement and nerves. She was not an astronaut. She never trained for this. But over the past months, as she had journeyed from her quiet garden in Vermont to the electric hum of a space launch facility, something profound had shifted. Age was no longer a boundary, it was a lens, focusing all her experiences into clarity and courage. She thought back to the early days, when the weight of regret pressed down like gravity, when loneliness wrapped tight around her like a storm cloud. Back then, she had felt invisible, lost beneath the noise of a world rushing past. But now, here, with the countdown ticking and the rocket towering above, she felt seen. Not by cameras or crowds, but by herself. The voice of Elon Musk echoed in her mind, a mantra he often repeated: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Evelyn had lived those words in her own quiet way, planting bulbs in frozen soil, reaching out to estranged family, sharing stories that bridged generations. Today, she was witnessing a larger kind of bravery. The launch director's voice came over the comms, steady and clear, T-10 minutes and counting. The crowd's murmurs softened. Evelyn's fingers curled around the railing. She glanced at the engineers nearby. One young woman caught her eye and gave a small nod. "We're ready," she whispered. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to her family. Malik, who had insisted she take this trip despite her doubts. Susan, who had kept the home fires burning and cheered her on from afar. Clara, who kept the garden thriving and carried forward the torch of hope. She wished they were here with her, to feel this moment together. The rocket's engines began their pre-ignition hum, a low growl that grew into a powerful roar. The ground vibrated beneath her feet. The smell of burning fuel mingled with the dry Texas dust. The countdown sped forward. T-1 minute. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly and breathed in deeply, grounding herself in the present. The moment was larger than fear or doubt. It was about trust, in humanity, in progress, in the indomitable will to try again. As the clock struck 0, the engines ignited fully. The Starship lifted slowly at first, then surged upward with an almost majestic power. Flames licked the base, light spilling like a dawn over the horizon. Evelyn watched, tears streaming down her face, as the rocket climbed higher and higher, a silver arrow piercing the sky. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers mixing with the crackling radio chatter of mission control. But Evelyn felt a quiet awe that transcended the noise. This was more than a machine breaking free from Earth's grip, it was a symbol of renewal. Of a life that refused to be defined by age or circumstance. The Starship arced gracefully, its trajectory perfect. The mission control team monitored every system, every sensor, every heartbeat of the vessel. Suddenly, a sharp beep cut through the radio chatter. A warning light blinked. The lead engineer's face tightened. "Telemetry dropping," he said. "We're losing data from one engine." The tension spiked instantly. The crowd fell silent, the joyful energy replaced by a collective breath held. Evelyn's heart pounded in her ears. She thought of every story she had heard, of setbacks, of failures, of the relentless drive to keep moving forward despite them. "Do not give up," she whispered to herself, the words a steady pulse in her mind. The engineers worked furiously, recalibrating, rerouting power. The Starship shuddered but held its course. Then, a collective sigh of relief as the signal stabilized. The rocket continued its climb, now with a new rhythm, a new determination. Evelyn realized then that the mission was not just about technology, it was about resilience. About bending but not breaking. About daring to fly even when the path wasn't perfect. The minutes stretched. The Starship reached the edge of the atmosphere, the curve of the Earth visible in the vast blue below. The final phase of the test was imminent, the controlled descent and landing, a maneuver that had eluded many before. The crowd watched in tense silence as the rocket began its return. Flames and smoke trailed behind it like a comet, the engines firing in a delicate ballet of power and precision. Evelyn's breath caught as the rocket descended, wobbling slightly against the sky. Then, with a thunderous roar, it touched down on the landing pad, a perfect vertical landing that sent a wave of exhilaration through everyone present. Cheers erupted again, louder and more heartfelt. Evelyn found herself laughing and crying at once, overwhelmed by the miracle of the moment. As the crowd dispersed, Evelyn was invited to join the SpaceX leadership for a small celebration. Elon Musk himself greeted her with a warm smile, the intensity of his gaze softened by genuine appreciation. "You did it," he said simply. "You found your own launch." Evelyn smiled back. "We all did." They talked long into the evening, about dreams and failures, about the power of stories to change lives, about the future waiting just beyond the stars. Elon shared insights into the next missions, the plans to build sustainable habitats on Mars, and the need for courage in the face of the unknown. Evelyn shared her journey, how the garden had grown from a place of quiet grief to a beacon of hope. How she had learned that age was not a cage but a compass pointing toward new horizons. When it was time to leave, Elon handed her a small, folded note. "For when you need it," he said. Evelyn unfolded it later that night in her hotel room. It read, "Remember, the final countdown is only the beginning. Keep reaching." The words settled in her like a promise. Back home, Evelyn's story spread even further. Interviews, talks, invitations poured in. But she remained grounded, choosing to spend her days tending her garden and nurturing the community that had supported her transformation. She started mentoring a new generation of dreamers, older adults hesitant to try, young people hungry for purpose, anyone who had felt too small or too late. The garden became a hub for workshops, storytelling sessions, and plans for community space exploration programs. Evelyn realized that her true mission was not just to witness the rocket's flight, but to inspire others to find their own liftoff moments. One afternoon, as she worked alongside Clara and a group of neighbors planting new seeds, a young man approached. He held a small notebook and looked nervous. "Miss Hammond," he said. "I just wanted to say, your story changed me. I'm starting my own project, building a solar-powered bike to help seniors in my town get around." Evelyn smiled warmly. "That's incredible. Every journey begins with a single pedal." The young man beamed. "I hope one day I can inspire someone the way you inspired me." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. "You already have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Evelyn stood quietly in the garden. She looked up, the first stars twinkling into existence. Mars was visible, a faint red dot among the constellations. She whispered, "We made it. Not just there, but here." The final countdown had ended, but the journey was just beginning, for her, for the rocket, for every person daring to believe that it's never too late to launch. Evelyn folded her hands and closed her eyes, the words echoing in her heart, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." And she knew, no matter what came next, she would keep reaching. Keep rising. Keep dreaming. Because the final countdown is only the beginning. Dawn broke slowly over the quiet town of Willow Creek, the first light filtering through the window of Evelyn's bedroom, brushing her face like a gentle reminder that every day was a gift. She woke with a deep breath, a calm certainty settling in her chest. Today was not just another day. It was the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for everyone who had dared to believe, to plant, to rise. The garden outside her window stretched toward the sky, green and vibrant, a living testament to time, care, and hope. Birds sang softly, and the air carried the faint scent of earth and blossoms. Evelyn sat up slowly, feeling the familiar aches but also the steady pulse of life coursing through her veins. She smiled, remembering the journey, how fear had once held her captive, how loneliness had felt like a permanent shadow, how she had thought her story was nearly finished. Yet here she was, still writing new chapters with every breath. The news of the Starship's successful test flight had rippled across the world. But more than the headlines or the accolades, what mattered most was the ripple effect it had inspired. Across the country, and beyond, people were waking up to their own possibilities, older adults starting new ventures, reconnecting with estranged family, daring to dream beyond limitations. Evelyn had become a quiet symbol of that transformation, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her story echoed the silent hopes of millions. She dressed quickly and headed outside, greeted by Clara and Malik who were already tending to the morning chores. They shared a smile, a tacit understanding that this day was different. Evelyn's phone buzzed. It was a message from Susan. "Ready for the ceremony? We're all so proud." Evelyn replied with a heart full of gratitude. Later that morning, the town gathered at the newly dedicated community center. Named the Starship Pavilion, in honor of the mission and the spirit it embodied. Flags fluttered, children's laughter filled the air, and faces both young and old shone with anticipation. Evelyn took the stage, her hands steady as she faced the crowd. She looked out and saw familiar faces, friends, neighbors, letters writers, the young man with the solar-powered bike, even the mail carrier who had once asked about a P.O. box. "Thank you all for being here," Evelyn began, her voice warm and resonant. "This place, this moment, is proof that beginnings don't come with deadlines. That no matter your age, your past, or your doubts, you can start again." When the Starship launched, it carried more than engines and fuel, it carried the dreams of all who believed we could reach beyond what seemed possible. She paused, the words settling like sunlight. "I want you to remember this, the journey to Mars is not just about distance. It's about daring. About lifting off from the weight that holds us back. About planting seeds in frozen soil and trusting they will bloom." Applause erupted, but Evelyn held up a hand. "This isn't just my story. It's ours. Every letter I received, every hand that reached out, every heart that refused to give up, that is the true mission. And it continues." After the speech, Evelyn moved through the crowd, hugs and tears mingling freely. A woman in her 70s grasped Evelyn's hands tightly. "You gave me permission to try again. I'm going back to school this fall." A man in his 80s shared a photo of a woodworking project he'd just completed. A teenager handed her a drawing of a rocket surrounded by blooming flowers. Evelyn's heart swelled with a profound sense of connection. That night, back in her garden, she sat beneath the pergola, the stars shimmering overhead. Mars was visible, a faint glowing ember against the vast night. She thought of Elon Musk's words, the spark that had lit her fire, and of every person who had joined her on this journey. The world was changing. The old stories of fading away were being rewritten. Evelyn felt the cool breeze brush her face and whispered, "We are just getting started." Her phone chimed, a message from Clara. "Look outside." Evelyn stepped to the window and gasped softly. The garden was alive with tiny lights, fireflies dancing like stars descended to earth. It was a moment of pure magic, a reminder that light exists even in darkness. The next morning, Evelyn woke with renewed purpose. She spent hours in the garden, planting new seeds, tending to the blooms, feeling the soil slip through her fingers like time itself. She drafted plans for a new project, a community space exploration club, open to all ages, where stories and science could intertwine. She reached out to local schools, libraries, and senior centers, determined to build bridges between generations. The world outside was no longer a distant place of missed chances but a landscape of opportunity waiting to be explored. Months passed, and the Starship Pavilion flourished. Workshops filled with laughter and learning. The garden grew wild and beautiful, a symbol of persistence and growth. Evelyn found herself mentoring not only dreamers but doers, people ready to transform their too old stories into just beginning realities. One afternoon, as she led a group through a telescope workshop, a young girl asked, "Miss Hammond, what do you want to be remembered for?" Evelyn smiled, eyes twinkling like the stars above. "For showing that no one is ever too old to reach for the stars." Years later, Evelyn's legacy was more than a garden or a blog or a single launch. It was a movement, a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of human connection. She often thought back to that first letter she wrote, the one where she told a stranger, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." She realized now that permission was never needed. The spark had always been inside. The journey to Mars had been the catalyst, but the true voyage was inward, toward rediscovery and renewal. As the sun set on Willow Creek, Evelyn stood quietly in her garden, surrounded by the fruits of her labor and the stories of countless souls who dared to try again. She looked to the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a delicate embrace, and whispered, "This is our new dawn. Our next great adventure." And with that, she stepped forward, into the light, into the future, into the boundless possibility of what comes next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?